So I'm going to invite each in turn, starting with Joanne, to speak for about 5 minutes or so about their hopes, the future that they envisage. Joanne.
Thanks ever so much, Rachel. And thanks for inviting me to speak to this conference. It's been an absolutely fascinating day with a really collaborative and positive zeitgeist, which I think is really encouraging. I want to talk to an issue that I think has come up a lot in the day, which is the contrast between personalisation and standardisation. And I want to speak to how important I think personalisation is, but also including the topic of AI and perhaps putting forward quite a dystopian future that brings us back to thinking about what matters and the things that we have through standardisation and ways that we're going to have to think about this disruptive technology of AI. Because essentially, we've been talking, as I said, very collaboratively, as though we all have the same values. Well, we don't. Education is essentially a values-based political project of society building, and we all have different views about how we should go about this. And amongst that are ed tech people and computer scientists who have their own views about what counts as learning and what counts as valuable learning. So there's something in that I think we need to be really, really cautious about. My first job as a graduate was in artificial intelligence at the Institute of Aviation Medicine in Farnborough. It's where they have all the air shows. And AI in those days was absolutely crap. You didn't even do voice recognition, and certainly not a Scottish accent. You could do the numbers 1 to 9 if you had a standard pronunciation. But we were thinking a lot about what it could mean for the future. So I went to work for the exam board, which I can tell you was much more exciting, by the way. It was much more interesting, the education project. And I went to see my boss and I said, look, I'm reading all this stuff, this review by Dave Bartram at Savile and Holdsworth. He's the top guy, and he's telling us that digital technology is going to be the basis of exams in the next 10 years. And he said, let me see that paper, and it was 1994. And he said, well, here's one from 1984. The guy said the same thing. So there's a question about why it hasn't moved more quickly that I think a lot of people have taken an interest in. So we know that also when we've had digital technology, it's tend to replicate the kinds of assessments that we saw before. It hasn't been very transformative. And we've been watching and waiting for this to come along. So the experience has been of sitting in the same exam halls that we've had for actually hundreds, 1,000 years in China. So there's been a question about when will we see transformation, and I really like this Redeker and Johansson paper of 2013, because basically they say the same thing as everybody else, any time now. But they had a graph that I've been laughing at for years when I've been teaching this, which essentially said, about 2025, this will all change. I'm not laughing anymore, you know, because we're seeing something really quite different now. What we're seeing is a disruptive technology that's been taken up at scale that's likely, so I mean generative AI, but there are other forms, as Rose Luckin mentioned earlier. So where does this take us then? Well, we can see what happened in other industries like music or communications when these disruptive technologies came along that were so attractive. They offered features that we didn't have before. The user experience was so much better that they undercut the whole industry model and upended it. What happened then too was that all of these industries, if you look at them, became less under national control, not even just under the same commercial controls. That transferred too. But they also left us with issues of transparency and issues with regulation. Just try and get a hold of your phone company these days to get anything sorted. So Ofqual has also been actually, in all fairness to them, trying to provoke the industry to have more digital assessments. They had competitions about producing digital assessments and so on. It's actually been part of their policy for quite a long time. But they also were looking at, well, what's preventing us here? So they produced a really interesting report on the barriers to large-scale digital assessment of the kinds that they regulate. There's lots there, the lack of infrastructure in schools, digital divides, all of the things that we're quite familiar with. But their model is the standardised model. It's not a personalised assessment model. So it's a well-trodden path that's been really well resourced. Regulations have been set up around it. And it's underpinned by issues about beliefs of what counts as fairness, which we've heard different views about today, about what counts as validity, where your emphasis is there, the importance of reliability, having a standardised assessment that's the same wherever you go, different schools and so on. There are issues of manageability, the utility of the qualifications, they have to have a purchase in the society, the cost of them and so on. But this is the dystopia that I want to take you to. In other industries where this disruptive technology has come in, it's cut across all of these things. So the relevance of the old structures fell away, which means that if big tech decided to start introducing assessments and tutoring systems that were actually really attractive, that assess the kind of things that we think are important, that employers think are important, rather than these traditional standardised disciplinary-based approaches that we've had. So if we really were very personalised and digital, and it was taken up at scale, then people like Ofqual and the exam boards are just far less relevant. In fact, the government has far less control over big tech as well. So if those were really the routes into employment and were accepted by universities and so on, everything changes. So be careful what we ask for around this, is really the sorts of thoughts that I've been having about this, because where are the regulations then, and where's the transparency? Who's deciding what the values are that underpin an assessment like that? So I think we need to be, and I know Rose Luckin also does this, by the way, we need to be thinking ahead about what those structures would be that continue to make the assessments something that we think are important, because there isn't an assessment that is independent from the kinds of learning that you get. They come together. The format, the way they're operated, and your instruments of assessment are deeply connected with how people teach and learn. So that's where we'd be heading with that. We'd be putting all of our money into something that perhaps educationalists were not involved in. I'm sorry if I'm offending anybody, but here we go. Have you spoken to a computer scientist who does the learning analytics and what they think learning is? Really strange conversations they are. It doesn't correspond to anything that I understand as learning, or even the kind of values that I would have. So I worry about those learning analytic models paired with psychometrics that come up with an outcome that I don't understand or particularly value. So our traditional methods of creating the things that the constructs, the things that we're assessing, are through theory, empirically driven, what we know people can do, subject matter based, using expertise through subject matter experts and teaching experts, or politicians have decided for us, policy driven. But the future adds another one, which is this learning analytics model, which I think is needs questioning. That's and tight control, I think. So I think there are various questions that this raises for us, and I will stop.
You're okay, fine.
The curriculum could be less constrained, and I think that's really something valuable, that's really interesting, that we could perhaps be assessing all sorts of characteristics of individuals, like leadership skills that are quite difficult to assess. I mean, that's one I've plucked out of the air, but there's a whole range of things, team working, that might be easier to assess using digital technologies and the sorts of technology that might be coming in over the next few years. But who defines the content? What is valuable learning to these people? Where are the quality checks on it? Who owns the data? Do we have any privacy around this? Is everything I've ever done going to be on my learning certificate? Am I effectively being surveilled by these technologies? And we know the danger of that is absolutely yes, because okay, I'm a professor at Oxford, but there have been a few failures along the way that I don't want any of you to know about. And that's how I learned. And it's really important. And we haven't all been successful in all of the things that we've done. That's just a model we have. And looking backwards, it looks as if we have, but lots of us have needed to go over the hurdle a few times. We've got about to have so one question is, under a model like that, what counts as learning? And we were talking about this earlier today too, that the AI can do so much for us. It's kind of got the knowledge content. So what are we going to define as learning, and what's the important thing that the human's doing under those circumstances? We've got a special issue of the Oxford Review of Education coming out, and it's actually based on Patricia Broadfoot's work, who's a sociologist of assessment. And she adds something new, I think. She talks about what we're going to need in the future is something she calls connoisseurship. So people are going to have to be able to look at the kind of information they're being presented with and understand how to value that. And that's a different kind of process. It's about evaluating the kinds of material that they're being presented with, and God knows, I think we're all already challenged with that with ChatGPT. Thank you.
Thank you, Joanne. I'm going to move straight over to Bill, and then we might tease out some common threads or some sort of dissonance between both of your expositions. Bill.
Thank you, Rachel. I really like the idea of connoisseurship. I can immediately see there's some kinship there. I've got three large hopes and an ill-organised cluster of mini hopes, and I'm going to just share those with you. One builds off the back of Sammy's reminder that we need to think about what the point of school is. It's something that I and my colleague Guy Claxton have been doing forever, and I think you need to keep asking that question. And I think the moment you think you've cracked it, you haven't. And I think you were asking it from the perspective of an underserved set of users. I tend to ask it from a breadth perspective, but there are lots of dimensions, I think, of asking that would be really relevant. The second is, I think it would be wonderful if, not just in this room, because we've done very well at this, if we could move beyond the nonsensical binary discussions about what matters in education. And I think particularly, is it knowledge or is it capabilities, dispositions and skills? And of course it's both, isn't it? And we all know that, but we too often refuse to have an elegant conversation about that. That was the image I had of the Andy Goldsworthy sculpture in my head. And the third is that I hope this movement continues to thrive. It seems to me we're beyond institution. We're a really healthy mix of academics, system leaders, school leaders, practitioners, not-for-profits, business folk, parents, random folk who've wandered in off the street and felt that Manchester is a pretty nice place these days to be. And I hope we move into a next phase, not just of shaping, but making. I think we've done some pretty effective shaping. And I think now in some cases we need some really powerful empirical evidence for what we've been articulating. And some of the questions need to get more nuanced. So for example, on a learner profile, what gets validated or warranted internationally, what nationally, what regionally, what locally, and what not at all? These are big questions, and I think we need to start to think of those at the same time as getting more people to build them. And now it just gets a bit random. So sparing Joanne's blushes, obviously I hope the curriculum assessment review comes up with all of these answers, but I suspect that they won't. And indeed, in a private conversation, which will therefore remain private, I suspect that Joanne may even, although of course she's too dignified to say so, not all of her dreams will happen. But I hope that the curriculum assessment review or others will recognise the key importance of some of the dispositions and capabilities we've been talking about. I think interestingly in Scotland, with the Skills 4.0 frame, there is an overlap between those things that might be considered to be important to employers and vocational pathways and those in schools. And we've not got that south of the border. I think we've got something a little bit closer in Skills Builder, and I'm really enjoying conversations with John and others at Pearson about how we might bring together the underpinning dispositions that sit in project qualifications, that sit in some of the vocational pathway qualifications, and bring those together into one handy compendium. I think we have to think more about rebalancing summative and formative, and those shouldn't be seen as silly oppositions. We've got to be clear what it is we're evidencing. I think the language itself about assessment, we tend to leap to measure or assess when we might choose to say evidence, and think more carefully about the verbs we use there. I think that we need massively to upskill the teaching profession in terms of assessment literacy and the use of formative tools, and to get really smart at spotting those ones that are rather silly Quizlets and those ones that are really helpful formative tools. I share Joanne's concerns about some of the learning analytics stuff that's being developed. I think we need to be really careful about that. Why can we not encourage more and more of our colleagues in the state sector, as well as the independent sector, to teach slightly fewer GCSEs and to embrace HPQ and EPQ models? I mean, it's there to be had. I think only 5% of young people take an EPQ, and it's a minuscule amount when it comes to HPQ. We've got an open door there, and some really talented people in this room to help support you to make that happen. I think we need to think more about place-based learning. So the places, this is, I think, part of what Sammy was talking to. We really need to understand now how that happens, how there's a learning ecosystem, how it's partly provided by informal learning providers as well as formal providers called schools and colleges and alternative additional provision, etc. I hope very much that if the Commission doesn't, somebody does, as the APPG on teaching learning assessment did. Somebody gives the green light to a serious next exploration of what a rollout of digital learner profiles should be. I think it would be the kiss of death if we try and roll it out, and we should really learn from the electronic patient record and some of the things that have been going on there. But I think asking and answering and minimally starting to get a generically agreed specification for what we'd like as a nation to see in that would be really, really helpful. I hope we can begin to bring in some external investment to help us do that, and a part in a small way of trying to do that at the moment. I think the RSA's Digital Badging Commission is an opportunity. Rosie Clayton is on that, I'm on that, a number of others in this room are. I think how we see these different railway systems connecting is really powerful and important. I really dream of a day when we go back to looking out internationally and to Europe as a source of pleasure, of trying to find promising practices from across the world, then of course adapting them to our culture, because I think we've become very anti-research and very anti-internationalist. And I hope, and this is partly learning from the work I've been doing in Australia and for PISA, that we recognise that there are some really sophisticated, engaging, scenario-based online learning assessments, which are both assessments of learning, assessments for learning, and assessments as learning. And if we can just find more of that, I think that would be deeply pleasurable. But I hope we really, really continue to talk about assessment as our friend, and not, as some colleagues do, as the thing that you have to avoid or do because you've been told to do it. It's so close to learning, as Anne-Marie was saying, and pedagogy. You can't put a piece of paper in between them. Unless we have that feedback, we're really not going to progress powerfully.
Thank you, Bill.
Bit random, sorry.
No, but very optimistic. It's
Of
a really
course.
nice way to finish the day. And we started this session with Joanne painting a picture of a dystopian future, which was really quite sobering, but important, I think, to reflect on. And then we started to have optimistic idea, tumbling over optimistic idea, and just a kind of smorgasbord of hopes and aspirations sort of for the future, which was lovely. Can I open it up to the floor for anybody either to ask a question of Bill or Joanne, or to just reflect a hope that they have for the future, or to raise any other point that they think it's important that we pick up on and don't lose from earlier in the day? Yes, gentleman in the middle near the back.
Hello, Mark House. I work for our own assessment, so we talk to countries all over the world, and I think there is a lot of hope out there at the moment. There's a lot of good stuff going on. I think what I picked up today is this, somehow we've got to fight against the tyranny of merit, and back to Michael Sandel here, and rediscover the common good. And it's about understanding what I think is going to be the common good. And some of the countries we talk to seem to have a clearer idea of what they think the common good is for their country. Mm. And I think that's something what I'm hoping to see get clearer.
Thank you for that. There's somebody halfway down the stairs on the end of the line, and then somebody just 2 rows from the front. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. It was great to hear you say, Bill, about the lack of international focus and attention in a more general sense than sort of typical anti-EU-ness, because it's rarely said, and to be honest, it's rarely listened to. I wonder what we can do about that. But there are actually a couple of examples closer to home which worry me. We heard earlier about the difficulty of bringing innovative assessment into schools and all kinds of things which sounded quite novel and exciting, which would be pretty common practice with many universities for a start. So group projects, individual marks, students marking each other, rare, possibly too rare, but not by any means unknown, nor even that new. So that raises, and likewise, there's another foreign country of which we know little, and I speak largely from a university perspective, and that's OUCEA. I will find people in universities going on all the time about micro-credentials, what we must learn from Europe, New Zealand, the US, followed after on the last one. And yet I say things like, what about OUCEA? Have you looked at their vocational courses and how they've been credentialed modularly for, I don't know, 15, 20 more years? And they look blank. And then they look kind of, well, we couldn't look at that, could we? So I think really one thought for the conference here is to perhaps drag in a few people from other sectors and maybe work it both ways, because I think there are things to learn. I mean, probably one answer is, oh, well, the government wouldn't let us do this. But I mean, that's always a dialogue. In a sense, one's probably got to start somehow before one seeks what permissions. And I thought the talk I liked today was the stuff about PQs, because there's a kind of legitimate way of prizing open the door a bit. And I thought it was really neat. And so, but can we just have a bit more dialogue, including those that tend to be dialogue of the deaf? I don't know how we do it, but I think it's a kind of, and I see this from my own perspective as having written reports on various sectors for various countries over far too many years.
Thank you. We'll take the point for the lady here in the white top.
Thanks very much. My name's Hannah. I work for National Citizen Service, NCS. I've found, it's been wonderful to be here and hear lots of optimism in the room about the potential for a broader approach to education, and I definitely see partnership with other sectors as part of that, including the youth sector. But it's interesting, someone shared with me the other day an article in The Economist, and I'm just going to quote something from it, which says, some hope that the government will shift the emphasis away from exams and towards nice-sounding life skills, such as creativity and teamwork. Yet, worsening grades in places that have pursued such a trendy path, including Scotland, which, like Northern Ireland and Wales, controls its own schools, suggests this is a dismal dead end. So I'm obviously reading that quote not because I agree with it, but because just to illustrate that there is a kind of school of thought, and obviously there's all the data that has come from Scotland that I've always thought has pursued a very interesting approach to the curriculum. And I think we need to be realistic that there will be maybe some concerns among a new government about how far it pushes the envelope. And I just want, given this kind of discourse in the media as well, so I just wanted to get the views of the panel on that and how to sort of counter that negative narrative.
Joanne, do you want to take that first?
Sure. So those dismal grades are PISA, aren't they? Which is really, really traditional. In fact, the correlation between PISA and IQ is higher than I've seen for any other educational test. So if you're going to do something different, expect your PISA scores to go down. But the difference between the four nations of the UK and PISA are tiny. They're absolutely tiny. They're usually within the confidence intervals, meaning that the means aren't actually significantly different. So I just don't have a whole load of store in PISA. But that's not to say Curriculum for Excellence went particularly well. Even if you like the curriculum, there was little thought given to how to implement it. The whole thought was that if you step back, teachers' professionalism could fill that void. So that's a lesson that we should be learning from what happened in Scotland. And the Welsh, I think, have tried to learn that. They've got another Donaldson-style curriculum. But of course, we've got austerity policies and all the rest of it that have made it really difficult for the Welsh to plug the teacher development gap associated with that as well. So what I'm saying about this is I think it's much more complicated than The Economist. I'm trying not to say the trouble with economists.
You're in the same company.
You never know.
Bill?
I think that story gets written about once every 3 months. And it's not just The Economist that runs it. It's the most lazy journalism out. I'm not a big fan of the main PISA test. I'm a big fan, I would be, wouldn't I, of the creative thinking test, but mainly because it was about putting it on the map. Note that Singapore, which does pretty well on the conventional PISA tests and very well on this, was right up there. So it's just it's in that false binary category. One of the interesting countries here, I think, is Finland, who were the poster boy or girl of the early PISA test when people got quite excited about them, especially in the first Blair term. And Patti Sahlberg was the much lauded Minister of Education. And they've now decided that whilst they have slipped down, they don't care about that, because what they are interested in is the other things. And so, as Joanne is implying, you need to think about, so how would you evidence those? And so I do think we could get really bogged down in here, and there's some very robust rebuttal that could take place, and it's very boring. Sorry, you're not very boring. I think the argument is very boring. I think we've just got to lift our heads above it, frankly.
Thanks, Bill. Did we have a couple of questions on this side? Yes.
Yeah, Andrew Hahn, I've got many hats on. One is that I am a member of a Worshipful Company of Educators, and we're actually doing something at Guildhall this February to do with the delivery of education through immersive technology. So this is right in the zone where I think everyone's talking. But this is about hope. And many years ago, when I first met Bill, I once went to an Ofqual meeting, and we were talking about digital development and the education, what was going to happen. And in that conversation, what had been completely missed out in the presentation was the use of the mobile phone. And really, my point is that we should be, as educationists, managing the technology, not be fearful of it, and to drive its development. And I was really echoing Anne-Marie's comment about that's a fundamental principle that needs to change within the system with government support. And I think we have a great wave of interest and support from across many, many sectors here. So that would be my hope, that government would embrace all that change.
Thank you very much. And I'm going to just have two more, Alison and then Sammy, final questions or final comments, and then if there's a response required, back to the panel.
Thank you. We've heard a lot about AI today. As a profession, if we're going to avoid what Joanne was talking about and that dystopian kind of response written by the EdTech, not taking notice of teachers, we need to have our voices heard. We've got a survey that we've just launched from the Chartered College of Teaching that is all about your experiences of AI, your hopes, your fears. Please complete that survey. We can begin to, as a profession, start to make sure that we take hold of the conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Alison. Sammy.
Thank you. So I just wanted to make a really, really important point, I think, about how we speak about these issues. And it's echoing what Bill said earlier about the problem with saying 21st century skills. And it links to this article in The Economist and also to what you're saying, Alison, about getting our voices heard. And that is, we have to remember that progress is only going to come through consensus. The nature of the political cycle means that if we push a kind of like yo-yoing pendulum model onto this, then it'll only be another 10 years and it'll get undone again. The true lesson of Finland, I think, is that they took 30 years of development and thinking before they got to the point where they implemented what they did. And it took education out of the political cycle. So I think we've got to be really, really careful in the way that we talk, because there are certain trigger words and phrases which we know are going to get kickback and reaction from people, and we have to make sure that we express ourselves in a way that doesn't just speak to the people in this room, but speaks to the people in other rooms as well.
Thank you, Sammy. I'm going to ask Joanne first and then Bill to perhaps do something that's a little bit impossible, but I'm sure they'll give it a really good stab, which is just in a sentence to sum up the primary hope that they will take away from this conference and from this collection of wonderful people here today. What will you leave here with hope in your heart around, Joanne?
Actually, I would say it's the teaching profession and how open you are to change, and I think that has had such a bad press over the years, but it's so obvious that lots of things are going on, they'll continue to go on, even if you're in a normative system that's got all these levers that act against the kind of progress that you'd like to see. That's certainly what I've taken from this Rethinking Assessment Conference.
Thanks, Joanne. Bill?
The paradox that most exam systems, most testing bodies give marks for one right answer or one quite right answer. And what we're really interested in is lots of answers, and we don't necessarily know which are the right ones. So finding a joyful continued dialogue with this group.
Thank you so much. Thank you to both my panellists. Really lovely way to end the day. Thank you.